Re-releases and special editions of albums are pretty common. It's a way of reselling a favorite album while giving something new and interesting to the fans. You can have remasters or bonus tracks or even a full remix of the original album to show a brand new side of the original. Sometimes they're a blessing, but sometimes less so. But they all provide something interesting and something worthy of scrutiny. My name is Michael, and across this series we will be looking at various remixes of famous albums and how they shed new light on their source material, and even improve on it, or fail to live up to its expectations. This is just a remix. This doesn't come up a lot on this channel, but I love Pink Floyd. I'd always known they existed, but something changed in 2012 when I heard my mum's vinyl copy of Wish You Were Here. For the next 5 years, they were all I knew. I obsessively researched their history, I tracked down bootlegs of live performances, only for them to just officially re-release them, the bastards. I owned all of their studio albums on record and once spent a full day spinning all of them. I like them a little bit. I did have to sell my records back in 23 though. Over the decades of existence, Pink Floyd have released a few alternate mixes of their beloved discography. While the world of mono, quadraphonic, and surround sound mixes of their albums is interesting, I will stay away from those for the time being. The mono mixes will get their own video, and I don't know enough about surround sound to justify talking about those mixes. For now, we will begin with dedicated new official stereo mixes of their work, and we will begin with their 1987 album, A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Pink Floyd's 13th studio album is a bizarre entry in their discography because for many, it's not really considered a full Pink Floyd album. This is a record that happened at a very uncertain time for the band. Head lyricist, bassist, and general douchebag Roger Waters had left the band in 1985, then turned around and tried to sue remaining members David Gilmour and Nick Mason for continuing to operate under the name Pink Floyd. After this fizzled out on account of Waters not having a leg to stand on, Gilmour and Mason started pushing around the idea of a new album based on music that Gilmour already had lying around. However, Mason didn't end up contributing much to the record. He did some work on sound effect design, but most of the drumming was handled either by session musicians or drum machines. Former keyboardist Richard Wright was also called to rejoin the band, but due to legal finagling around the fact that Waters had fired him from the band in 1979, he only appears on the album in a minimal capacity as a session musician. It wouldn't be until the 90s that Wright would fully rejoin the band. The key takeaway for all of this is that for a Pink Floyd album, Momentary Lapse sounds very weird. Gilmour's trademark guitar solos are still to be heard, but without Mason's reliable drumming or Wright's keyboard touch, something is definitely missing. Combined with the use of drum machines and the very 80s production of it all, it's definitely the Pink Floyd album that's aged with the least grace. Which isn't to say that I don't like this record, I actually really do. It might be in many ways a David Gilmour solo album that wears the label of a Pink Floyd record, but it's a pretty good one. The songs themselves are all pretty solid, and in fact would go on to be served a lot better when the band took them on tour. There, with Mason drumming and Wright playing live as a session musician, they felt a lot more Floydian, which at last brings us to the remix. As early as 2004, Nick Mason was pushing around the idea of a rework of Lapse in his book Inside Out. There, he suggested that a new version of the album where the drum machines are replaced with his own drumming could be put together, as he regretted not playing them on the album in the first place. This would become the basis of the remix of Lapse that would be released in 2019, first as part of a retrospective box set and then eventually by itself. In terms of remix projects, Lapse 2019 is a fascinating one. Rather than just remix the album from its stems, it's been pretty heavily reworked in places. Any sign of drum machines are removed. Now instead, new drums were recorded, performed by Mason. Many of the more 80s synths or effects such as gated reverb on the drums are removed. Recordings of Wright playing the song's keyboard parts live from tour were carefully mixed into the studio versions, ensuring that his touch is also present on the record. In essence, it's an attempt to create an image of what this album would have sounded like if Gilmour, Wright, and Mason had recorded the album together in the studio from the word go, with a side of trying to de-80s it a little bit. So what are the results? The changes between the original and the remix become apparent very quickly on the opening track, Signs of Life. This is a pretty synth-heavy track, one that eventually gives way to a classic David Gilmour guitar solo. Some of the changes on the remix are pretty subtle. The synths ring out with a little more clarity, Gilmour's guitar has been brought up in the mix, things like that. But the really exciting change is the most obvious one, a brand new synth melody, one that Wright had played live for the track on tour. Immediately the track is transformed, whereas the original sounds a lot more desolate. With the counterpoint provided by Wright's new keyboard track, it comes to life. Immediately, this feels a lot more familiar. as a Pink Floyd album. In a way, Signs of Life is a pretty good indicator for how the rest of this remix project will go. Some of the changes made are pretty subtle, but others vastly rework the album, making it into something completely new. We'll begin with the tracks where the changes are a lot more subtle. It was seen that there was an if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality when it came to this remix. If the songs already originally had some pretty good mixes to begin with, then I'll leave them alone. Take Learning to Fly, for example. Compared to other songs on this album, the general structure of the mix hasn't been altered massively. There are new keyboard parts, an organ provided by Wright plays along the final guitar solo. Another one is either added to the rest of the song or brought up from being buried in the original mix. The drums have been replaced too, now played by Mason. But beyond that, this remix serves more to make elements from the original clearer and more distinct. The same goes for the remix of On the Turning Away. Beyond Mason's new drums and some new keyboard pieces, the most notable one playing over the final guitar solo, not heaps actually changes beyond subtly making elements of the song clearer. For example, an acoustic guitar that becomes buried in the mix in the original is brought out in the remix, ringing along to the final solo. However, there is one major change in the remix of On the Turning Away that is worth noting, and it's that the vocal take from the original mix is replaced by one that sounds, to my ear anyway, lifted from a live performance. On the turning away, on the turning away. It's an interesting choice to make, but not one I can think of a reason for doing. Sorrow is also one of the more subtle of the remix spectrum, the remix here mostly stripping back some of the synth parts to make room for the new Hammond organ parts played by Wright and replacing the drum machine with Mason. However, this isn't to say that these more subtle remixes don't make a difference. They really do. Mason's drums alone give an all-new energy to the tracks in question, and the new organ parts from Wright are really exciting to hear. This is especially obvious on the instrumental track Terminal Frost. Simply by replacing the drum machine with Mason's drumming and bringing Wright's piano further to the front, the track has given a completely new life. It almost feels like a live recording and is a fair sight more energetic than the original mix. It's also worth noting that the remix of Terminal Frost brings the backup singers further into the foreground, which does help the live performance feel of it. But it's in the more drastic reworkings that the vision of this project really shines through. Take for example One Slip, the song Pink Floyd released as their teaser for this remix. It begins on the more subtle side. The same parts are all there, the synths, Gilmour's slow fading in guitar. However, slowly changes appear. The programmed toms are replaced with the real deal, played by Mason. Gilmour's guitar intro is sharper and more clear, as is the twinkling synth. Then the song kicks in proper and everything changes. On the original, the main body of the verses is awash with very, very 80s guitar overdubs and drums soaked in the classic 80s gated reverb. But on the remix, the drums are treated with a more natural reverb. The guitar elements are stripped back, either muted or deprioritized in the mix. Instead, the bass guitar comes up, now driving the track forward. A new organ part from Wright plays in the right channel, bringing more life to the track. It has been completely transformed. Instead of an overproduced 80s number, it becomes what it was probably always meant to be, a mildly cheesy piece of stadium rock through a Floydian lens. It actually feels like something Pink Floyd would play. Yet Another Movie is another track that has been completely transformed. Much like One Slip, it begins sounding pretty similar. The heavily processed percussion that opens the track is much the same. But when the instruments enter, the song is markedly different. The synths from the original have been drastically deprioritized in the mix, either mixed down like the main synth pad, or removed entirely in favor of a piano played by Wright. The track is now driven forward by Mason's drums and a dour bass line provided by Tony Levin. The The original song was rather melancholic, but this remix is even moodier, bordering on pessimistic. It much better fits the rather bleak lyrics of the track and improves the song drastically. However, the track Round and Around that serves as a coda to yet another movie is largely untouched by comparison. I suppose they didn't feel there was a need to change much there, as it's only a minute long and more of a transition anyway. However, the shining achievement of this remix is saving the song The Dogs of War. On the original album, this is a stupid song. On the remix, it is too, in all honesty. The lyrics on it are not Gilmore's best. For hard cash, we will lie and deceive. Even our masters don't know the webs we weave. This is riveting stuff, David. On the original album, however, these kind of lame lyrics are accompanied by a kind of lame instrumental. But on the remix, they managed to dig a diamond out of the rough. Once again, a massive difference is made by replacing the drum machine on the original with Mason actually playing the part himself. But with White's almost angry organ in the right channel and some added reverb to make the track sound like it's being played live, the song becomes something else. It's still by far the least good complete song on the album, but now at least you can hear what they were going for. It sounds like Pink Floyd is playing it. So the question is, with all these changes, were Pink Floyd successful? Did they succeed in creating a version of A Momentary Lapse of Reason that fits into their discography better? Have they made this album sound a little more like a Pink Floyd record and a little less 80s? Well, yes and no. The no is that sorry, this still sounds pretty 80s. You can take away the gated reverb on the drums and the cheesy synths, but the fact of the matter is, this still could not be more clearly a product of the 80s. Gilmour said many times in the lead up to releasing this album that the band were wary of backlash and were essentially playing it safe. It would seem that translated into playing it safe sonically too, going along with the 80s, so as to not invite backlash. Clearly that worked out well for them, but the thing is, I don't think that this makes this a bad album. Pink Floyd's Playing It Safe is still a hell of a lot better than other people's great hit. Even if it's still soaked in 80s stadium rock, Sorrow is a killer track no matter what mix you're listening to. The same goes for Learning to Fly. They're good songs, they just happen to be good songs you wouldn't get any other time than the 80s. But as for their other objective, making this album feel more cohesively Floydian, this remix triumphs and then some. The new keyboard and drum tracks really do go miles to make the album feel more organic, more like a band playing it together than a project done entirely on synths and drum machines. The stripping back of extraneous overdubs allow you to hear the musicmanship of these musicians, giving new life to these songs. The remix of A Momentary Lapse of Reason didn't exactly convert many naysayers when it was released nearly 6 years ago. 6 years ago? Fucking hell. But it absolutely does throw into context what the band was trying to do. Get back on their feet with a brand new album and say, we're here to stay. And this mix really does make it a better album. As I said earlier, it was the remix that made me realize that One Slip is actually a pretty darn good song. Since the remix's release, I have switched to listening to that one and not looked back. But what do you think? Give them a listen to yourself and let me know. And in the meantime, like, subscribe, ring that little bell, all that silly nonsense, and I'll see you next time.